Hello, my friends. Angela here. Hey, I wanted to preface this episode really quickly and let you guys know we're going to be talking a lot about interventions and choosing a treatment center. What are some of the things to consider, questions to ask, things to look for on websites, all that kind of stuff. And if you guys need help with any of that, I'm happy to answer your questions and give you any guidance you need. You can go over to addictionunlimited.com. Right on the homepage, you can either leave me a voice message or fill out a contact form. Either way, we'll get your questions answered. addictionunlimited.com. I hope you guys love this episode. Hey everybody, welcome to the Addiction Unlimited podcast, where you get to learn everything you want to know about addiction and recovery. I'm your host, Angela Pugh, co-founder of Kansas City Recovery, life coach, and recovering alcoholic. To learn more about me, you can listen to episode 0 on your podcast app or find us on the web at addictionunlimited.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the Addiction Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Angela Pugh. We are recording today in Columbia, Missouri, and I have my lovely friend, Jessica Masters, with us. She is a treatment professional, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about herself and what she does and give us some great information about what to look for in treatment centers and things like that. Hi, Jessica. How are you?
Hi, Angela. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So fill in our listeners and tell them a little bit about what you do and how you do it.
So my role, I am a treatment placement specialist, and I work for an organization called Acadia Healthcare. So a large part of my job is working alongside clinicians and outpatient practices and really families and helping them make informed treatment decisions, helping them guide them in their search for recovery, and just give them the tools that they need.
You get tons of questions about treatment, obviously, in different treatment centers and things like that. That's something I deal with a lot too. Calls from families, certainly in my intervention practice, right? Like, what do you look for in a treatment center? And we've been talking about this a lot on several episodes of my podcast. Like, what are some things that you would say are really important for a family when they're looking at a website? You know, because one of the things that's hard is you can say whatever you want on a website, right? And so many of the treatment centers say a lot of the same stuff. I mean, there is only so much that we can do as treatment professionals. There's only so many services to offer, so they start to sound the same. What are some of the things you would say are really important to look for when you're looking at a website or looking at a treatment center?
Right. That's been a huge topic of conversation lately. And a lot of what I work with families on is, what does your life look like in recovery? What drives you? Do you like horses? Is equine even something that you're interested in? Do you like yoga? Are you an outdoorsy person? Or do you like to be inside and do more arts and crafts? Or what does your life in recovery look like? Because it's not the same for everyone. And so a lot of those conversations are more about like, what did your life look like before alcohol and drugs? Let's get back to that.
Right.
The other thing I think is the co-occurring mental health piece is always so important. And can the facility manage that and get you to a place where you can work on what's underlying the substance use disorder?
Right. So 2 things. I love that you talk about lifestyle, because to me, that is a huge piece of figuring out what treatment center is a good fit for what person. Because it's not what I always say to families. I'm like, don't send me to an outdoorsy program, right? Because I don't want to go outside. Right. Like, you can send me to the spa program and I will thrive. but that is an important part of it. And sometimes families can be angry too. And they're like, well, I'm not sending them somewhere to enjoy themselves. Right. I'm like, it's not about pleasure, but it is about, I want them, when they get where they're going, I want the person to be able to relax and identify with the people around them.
Right. And be comfortable.
And be comfortable. Absolutely. Because if I'm not comfortable, all I'm going to think about is how uncomfortable I am.
Absolutely.
And I'm not going to focus on getting better.
Well, and the process of recovery is uncomfortable enough.
Yes.
So, at some level, the amenities do help provide some level of comfort from the emotional discomfort or, physical discomfort of detox and things like that.
But I think you have to start working on the fun part too, because if my sobriety isn't fun, I'm not going to stay.
Right.
If I don't enjoy myself, even in my leisure activities while I'm getting treatment, there has to be a fun component.
Absolutely.
I think that's so big.
Yeah.
Okay. So thing number 2 is co-occurring mental health. I feel like this is really confusing for people because there are so many behaviors and thought processes that get screwed up as a product of our addiction, right? And substance use. So how long should somebody be in treatment and substance free before you can start to really separate what is because of substance and what is actual mental health?
Right. And I don't know the exact number to that, but that's a good point because, long-term substance use can look like a lot of things. It can obviously look like depression. It could even look like psychosis. It can look like some really significant mental health disorders. I think the important part are when I talk to families who say, my son has always been depressed. He's always been anxious. And then he picked up alcohol in college. And to me, I'm like, well, that makes sense that he would do that. Of course he would, to calm the anxiety.
Self-medicating.
Right. And so in those instances, I think if we never treat the depression, if we never treat the anxiety, he could be in and out of treatment his entire life.
Yeah.
If we keep just putting a Band-Aid on things.
Right. I always tell people that there does have to be sometimes substance free, because sometimes families will call and they're really focused on that mental health piece. And most facilities address the mental health piece. Most people understand mental health, substance abuse go together. Mm-hmm. We have some underlying issues we have to deal with, that sort of thing. But they can be so hyper focused on the mental health piece. And I'm like, we can't even talk about that at this stage of the game, right? We have to have somebody with a clear mind.
Right. To untangle.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it just does take some time. And I don't know that there is any specific time frame, but I think that people going into the treatment process can't be too eager to get to that part, because it is going to be a little bit down the road.
Exactly. And I think that kind of going back to your initial question, that co-occurring buzzword is on 99.9% of websites.
Right.
And so I think when you're looking at a facility, asking, what does that mean for you? What does co-occurring look like in a residential setting? And it's going to vary facility by facility. But if that is part of, your process or your loved one's process, just asking, what does that mean? Or how does that look?
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say is your biggest hurdle? When you're trying to find the right place for somebody to go, what do you find yourself coming up against regularly?
Well, I would say the insurance process. So a lot of families that I work with, they don't know what they don't know about insurance and about medical necessity and about in-network, out-of-network, deductible, out-of-pocket maximum. So all of these numbers and acronyms that are used in the treatment world, a lot of my role is just slowing down and talking through all of this. These are your options. This is what in-network looks like. This is the benefit of using your in-network benefits. This is what out-of-network looks like. And this is the benefit. And just really
I like that you just said
down.
that this is the benefit of out-of-network, because most people just view, out-of-network,
Right.
It's going to be more money out of pocket. I can't do that. But there are some benefits in that arena too. Yeah. Insurance is fairly new to me also. Obviously, I'm not a treatment center, but as an interventionist, in the beginning of my career, everybody paid cash for treatment.
Yep.
And then these last several years, this insurance component has come in. And in some ways, it is kind of frustrating, because I feel like there's something really uncomfortable with insurance companies dictating people's treatment and what that looks like, and insurance companies figuring out what they think somebody needs or doesn't need, or length of stay at a facility. That makes me really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Where when people paid cash for treatment, they paid for a certain length of time, and that's what they did and that's what they got. And I feel like in some instances, people got much better treatment.
Sure. Yeah. And the reality is that insurance is gradually cutting length of stay shorter and shorter. And we are seeing that.
Yeah,
So
I
that
had
is a
to
result.
even in my sober living houses, we used to say minimum 28 days sober to come into sober living. And I had to amend that because treatment centers are they're discharging people at 18 to 21 days now.
Yeah, that's 21 is about the average last I heard was.
Yeah. It's depressing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially as a recovering person, when I think of myself at 3 weeks in, like there was not a lot of stability.
Right.
And I'm so grateful for people that are looking at sober living and going into sober living for that added support, because it does increase your odds of achieving long-term sobriety. But it's just sad that people are not getting the treatment that they deserve, and they're not getting enough treatment, long enough treatment to really set them up to be successful when they get out. And that's what makes me sad.
I agree. And that's a big part of my role as well. So I don't stop working with the families or the clinician or the facility when they admit it. That's really when my work starts, is figuring out what does their process look like when they leave? Is it to return home to their family? And if so, how do we make sure that they have a solid IOP or a really strong AA group that they can return to? But ideally, it's a sober living house, a PHP with boarding, somewhere that they can live, that has sober supports, that has some monitoring and some accountability.
Yeah, I think that's where that fun piece comes into play too. And I talk about this a lot, that the business of recovery and the tragedy of addiction is so freaking serious. That I feel like we just start to overlook the fun part. And really, when somebody is coming out of treatment, it is an equally important component of a recovery process, is to enjoy yourself and start creating and building relationships with other sober people.
Exactly.
But you have to enjoy your life, especially when we get sober so young. Again, if my sober life isn't fun, I'm not going to keep doing it.
Right.
So there has to be a fun part.
And you and I have talked about this as well, the difference in the Midwest as opposed to being in California or Florida or somewhere where there are large communities of sober individuals. There, like you mentioned one time, that if you're at a meeting and someone says, let's go surfing tomorrow, 30, 40, 50 people will show up.
Right.
Obviously, we can't go surfing here in Missouri.
Right.
But similarly, it's not as easy to build that network of sober people to have fun activities and to fill that void.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely different here. LA, is my second home. And that's what I was talking about. I went, this was several years ago, and just some people at my favorite group out there, I used to be a lot more regular at and had a lot of friends out there. And they said, we're scuba divers. And we said, let's do a dive trip tomorrow. And literally like 30 people showed up to go diving. I mean, it was amazing, like we all just called our friends, hey, we're going to go dive. And it was totally impromptu, but it was awesome. I always joke, like, I can't even get 3 people to go see a movie here, like it's harder to get people together. And we just don't have the numbers that they have in those other bigger cities. Hopefully that'll be changing soon.
I was just going to say, and, in part thanks to places like Kansas City Recovery and sober living houses that are really encouraging that piece. I hope that we see some change in that or some movement in that.
Yeah, that's huge for me in the sober living houses, is that sense of community and really encouraging our guys to invite their sober friends, invite your friends from meetings to come over and watch football games, or we do a lot of service work, a lot of work in our community, and, having them invite people to do that stuff just to build that community where we can have fun and at the same time be of service. That's another component I think it's irreplaceable. Absolutely. In recovery. Like, I have to be giving of myself and volunteering myself and my time and helping other people. It's just so important for our self-esteem and just our personal development. It's so good.
Absolutely. We get so caught up in our stuff and our struggles. And then when you go out, you meet other people and you see what they're going through and how you can be of service. It really changes that lens that you see life through.
Yeah. Well, also how we view ourselves. It makes me feel like I can be a good person.
Absolutely.
So talk a little bit more about insurance and medical necessity. Explain that for our listeners.
Yeah, that's such a hot topic when I work with families, because often I will get the call from families saying, I talked to my insurance company, they said that they'll cover it. And that's wonderful. That's really great. the piece that's missing is that they will cover it based on medical necessity. So there are certain, substances that they will cover detox for, not all of them. And then there are certain behaviors, there are certain substances that they'll cover residential treatment for as well. So it depends on the frequency of use. It depends on the amount of use, how long you've been using. A lot of things like risky behaviors insurance looks at. So are you stealing or engaging in really high risk behaviors? Insurance is more apt to cover when those things are involved. Obviously, suicidal ideation and co-occurring depression, anxiety, trauma is going to be another question that they're asking. But all of those things come into play, which is why when you're working with a facility, another key piece is their assessment on the front end. Are they asking the right questions? Are they kind of tapping into what's going on enough that they can present a good case to the insurance company to get you an adequate length of stay, to get some time under your belt and stay sober?
Right. So assessment for everybody out there, even like when I do an intervention, we have treatment lined up right before we ever walk in the intervention, like all those pieces are in place. But as soon as the intervention is over and the person has agreed to go to treatment, the first thing I do is get on the phone with the treatment center so they can do an assessment of that person. They ask a series of questions to figure out exactly what they're working with and to start that process, I think, of verifying benefits and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's usually 30 to 40 minutes. So it's pretty in depth. And certainly when you're in that place of, where you've been through an intervention or your family is really encouraging treatment, it's a hard time to answer those questions, but it is very important.
Yeah. Yeah, for the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my biggest frustrations in this whole process is detox, and where we have opiate addiction out of control, opiate overdose and death out of control. And I try to take somebody to a detox center that is an IV heroin user shooting up heroin on a daily basis. And I take them to detox, and detox wants to fill them with some meds and send them home.
Yeah.
And this breaks my heart. What are some of the key components that are considered why they won't keep somebody in detox? Is it a lot of the same stuff you're talking about with treatment?
Yeah. So detox is even stricter, the medical guidelines. So you can't enter detox until you're in active withdrawals. So there's actually a scale and a check system that they use to say, are you sick enough to come get detoxed? And so when you call a detox facility, they'll actually time it out. Like, when's your last use? Okay, coming in 12 hours because we anticipate you will be feeling pretty crappy.
Right.
And then insurance will cover you to have a medical detox.
Yeah. I've had people say to me that they actually would go drink before going to detox just so they would keep them, because otherwise they're going to send them home.
And thankfully, with the recent introduction of medication-assisted treatment, things like Vivitrol and Suboxone, there is the kind of an intermittent step between detox and residential, or something that can allow people to have kind of a segue if they're not able or willing to do residential or like a full 30-day. Medication-assisted treatment does help kind of meet those needs for some individuals.
So if I remember correctly, and you're going to know more about this than me, if I remember correctly, in the beginning of Suboxone, it really was supposed to be for withdrawal, right? A temporary withdrawal medication to make that process easier, not so painful, obviously. Where did the shift come where now it's being used more long-term as a maintenance medication instead of just for withdrawal? Like, what was the segue for that? Like, how did that happen?
And so there are still some facilities that are abstinence-based. So they use Suboxone as usually somewhere in between like a 7 to 10, 7 to 12 day, maybe 14-day taper to help someone feel better. And then there are facilities and outpatient facilities that are using it more long-term. And I think the argument comes in this like quality of life. So someone could be using Suboxone, and yes, it is an opiate medication, but they're able to function, get up and go to work. They're not at risk for overdose and death. The quality of life obviously is much greater than if they're using heroin. So I think there's two schools of thoughts on it. I'm not exactly sure when the switch happened, but I think that's kind of the conversation that happens in the medical field.
Well, and it's a lot, I think, to harm reduction.
Right.
Obviously, when overdose death skyrockets, you have to look at options, right? And what can be good for people. I know it's something we come up against in sober living regularly, right? And Suboxone is a really difficult thing to consider in a sober living environment because I don't necessarily fall on either side. Like I don't have a staunch stance on how I feel about medication assisted treatment. I want people to be well,
right.
Right. And I don't think that journey looks exactly the same for every person. I'm also not a fan of people taking something super long term because then I feel like we're not dealing with the underlying things, right? Because really for me, I haven't had a drink in a long time. I don't get to be sober just because I want to be sober. I have to work on it. But the core of it is I have to feel good enough as a human being that I don't want to use a substance. And that's the part that scares me. But in sober living, Suboxone, it's still abusable.
Yeah.
Because it still has an opiate in it. It's a partial blocker, but it's still abusable. And it also will trigger other people. So I have to take into consideration the culture of my whole house. If I have somebody in the house on Suboxone and I have 2 other opiate addicts in the house and they know there's Suboxone in the house, well, now I have a situation that's really uncomfortable because that triggers their addiction too.
Exactly. And I love that you said that you don't have a strong opinion either way. And that's kind of the beauty of my job is that I get to say, it doesn't matter what I think. It's about you and it's about what's going to work for you. And so if you want a program that's going to set you up on a medication assisted program, long-term, great. I have, a half a dozen in mind. But if you're of the same mindset where this is short-term, just till I feel better, you know what? I've got 35 plus programs that we can talk about. So it's nice that I get to say, what do you want? What works for you? What have you tried?
Right. What do you do if you get a call? And we should probably explain the company that you work for too. But what do you do when you get a call if your company doesn't have a facility that fits them?
That's a good question. So Acadia Healthcare is the company that I work for. They're a national company. They're actually the largest behavioral healthcare company in the US. And so we have hundreds of programs across the US. And so when I get a call, I'm really working with the family on what are the diagnoses? When did this start? What have they tried? Again, what does their life and sobriety look like? What is the financials, insurance, and location? Does it make sense for them to stay local? Or is this an opportunity for them to get away, kind of change their life and potentially start over? So from the beginning, it's really about this individual. It's not about Acadia programs. It's not about non-Acadia programs. And so I get to really have an open mind. And the nice part about my role is that Acadia encourages that, to place people in a facility that is best for them and meets their needs and do the right thing.
Do you have facilities also that service like process addictions?
We do. So we do have some that will work with co-occurring gambling or sexual compulsivity. We also have facilities that are primary mental health. So if someone has, struggled with addiction in the past, but now their mood disorder is really popping up and becoming a primary issue, we have facilities that can work with that, especially trauma. Obviously trauma is really complicated and complex and can last a really long time if someone doesn't work through that.
That's something I say a lot too is, when we send people to addiction treatment over and over and over again, and it's really not sticking, it's typically because we're treating the wrong issue and we need to start looking at treating trauma and some mental health stuff, right? Because addiction really is a symptom of the underlying things, right? And a lot of us can do intensive outpatient or even an inpatient residential program, something like that, and get a lot out of it and go on and be sober and live happily and healthy. But some people have deeper trauma and things like that will continue to drive them back. So when treatment isn't working time and time again, it's a good time to have a conversation about other issues.
Exactly. And, even things like traumatic brain injuries and autism spectrum disorder and co-occurring eating disorders, there's a lot of things that need to just be checked on before entering treatment, just to say, is this present? Is this something we need to look at? Because you're right, when someone has been through treatment facilities and something's not sticking, it's likely that we're missing something.
Right. I have to have the same conversations with intervention because it doesn't happen a lot, but I definitely have had many times that a family will call, and as we start to get into more information where they think it's a primary substance issue, it may be a primary something else. And that can shift. For me as the interventionist, I may need to refer that to a different interventionist because there are certain things that I don't have the knowledge and experience to do that. Eating disorders is the biggest one for me. I will not do an eating disorder intervention because that's just not my scope of practice. It's not where I'm comfortable. I'm not going to be good in that situation. I'm not going to be the best in that situation, so I need to get that person to somebody that can do that.
Right. And that's my background. I worked at an eating disorder facility for about 10 years. And so it is a very specialized field. I mean, as a substance use disorder, they're both very specialized and there is some overlap. But I think the point of saying when you reach a point where you say, I'm not the best fit, is being able to say, you know what, but I know someone who can help you. And I always say, if I'm not the last call that someone makes, I want to be the second to last call.
Right. So when you say you have facilities for process addictions, does it still have to be a substance use disorder primary and then process secondary? And for those listeners that don't know, process addictions are addictions that don't have a physical dependency, right? Like drugs and alcohol, my body becomes dependent on. Process addictions are eating disorders, sex, gambling, things like that don't have a physical component. Did I explain that well?
Yeah, perfect.
So if somebody has substance and sex addiction,
which is so common
for sure, especially compulsivity for sure. But if their sex addiction is the primary, do you have facilities that will do that, or does it still have to be substance abuse primary?
That's a great question, and something that comes up often. So in order for insurance to pay for treatment, it does have to be a substance use primary. Mm-hmm. So if it's gambling or sex addiction primary, those are usually self-pay facilities. If that's their main modality of treatment, mm-hmm. then it is usually an out-of-pocket cost. So, but insurance will pay if we're working on the substance use disorder and also talking about some of the process addictions at the same time. They will cover that as a secondary.
It's so interesting trying to figure all that stuff out too, because as an addicted person, my listeners hear me say this on every episode. I mean, I can be addicted to anything, so it's interesting to sort those things out too. Even for me, as I haven't had a drink in a long time, I'm still an addicted person, and my addiction just pops up in different ways. Now, sorting it out, it's like you have to figure out what is addiction and what is compulsive. Is it completely out of balance? Is it taking over my life? There's a lot of things to think about and figuring out where you fall in that spectrum. But those are important things to know. Certainly when you're looking for treatment, you have to know what are the primary issues that have to be addressed, because you have to choose the right facility to address those things.
And that's the power, right, of AA and working with a mental health professional is our journey doesn't stop after 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. It's our entire life where we have to look at, am I, becoming overly compulsive on this one thing, or do I need to pull back and really reevaluate my relationship with this other thing? And it's a constant push and pull and figuring out, am I maintaining, true to my sobriety? Am I staying true to myself?
Yeah, because when I get uncomfortable with whatever feeling, right? Whether it's boredom or anger or whatever the feeling might be. Maybe I get my feelings hurt. Maybe I go through a breakup and you're just uncomfortable. As an addicted person, typically I would turn to alcohol to solve that problem. Well, now that I don't drink alcohol, there is still an urge to do something when you're uncomfortable. You want to do something to make yourself feel better. So it could be, for me, it's food, right? That's been a big struggle for me that I've really been talking about openly recently. Also spending, I have to be careful with that because there's no better way to make myself feel better than to buy a new pair of shoes, right? So
nice, shiny.
yeah, right. But I have to be mindful of that stuff because those behaviors don't disappear just because I put the bottle down.
Exactly.
So talk to me a little bit about outcomes and when treatment centers, like I have seen this a lot on websites where people want to talk about success rates and things of that nature. Or is there a way to really accurately measure outcomes? And is it responsible to talk about success rates?
That's a good question. And I think it kind of ties in nicely with the insurance information we've been talking about. A lot of my colleagues and I are seeing insurance really pushing these facilities to say, we want to see outcomes. We want you to be accountable for the work that you're doing and the services that you're providing to these families and these individuals. And so I think there is a good way to measure outcomes. It's time consuming and it's costly and it's difficult, but it's totally worth it and it's necessary.
And when you say outcomes, what are those things? What does that mean exactly?
So, like you said, success rate. So we're looking at how often are people getting sober and staying sober. And then, as we had mentioned before, the co-occurring mental health piece is so important. So are we seeing a reduction in their depressive symptoms? Are we seeing a reduction in their anxiety? Are their PTSD symptoms, resolved or diminished at least?
Do they try to measure length of sobriety?
I think that most facilities do try to measure length. The difficult piece comes the further out people are from treatment, especially those that are doing well, they're less likely to respond to some type of outcome or to some type of outreach call.
Well, we're also addicted people, so we lie. You know what I mean? Like, especially if I'm back in my addiction. If I'm drinking again and you call me and say, hey, Angela, it's been, 18 months since you left treatment. How are you doing? Are you still sober? I'm going to tell you yes. And I'm going to tell you everything's fantastic. That doesn't mean it's the truth. So I think that's where it gets confusing for me. And also, like, I remember years ago when I first got sober and reading all these things about length of sobriety and, the percentages they like to throw out. And, only 8 to 10% of people are successfully sober. And then you start to dig into it and it's like what they consider successfully sober is 1 year of sobriety. And I don't know what success is, right? I feel like that's a really personal thing. Like, I feel like if I'm getting better consistently, I feel pretty successful. Abstinence is fantastic, but that's not always a linear, that's not always a linear process for everybody. So I just think it can be really deceiving. And when people talk about success rates, I feel like they should be more transparent about exactly what it is that they're measuring and what that looks like.
Exactly. And like you mentioned earlier, even though someone's not drinking or using drugs, that doesn't mean that they're not engaging in gambling, overeating,
right?
Those type of behaviors. The other thing that we see with outcomes is that they're often skewed because the people that are responding are those who are maintaining sobriety. And so then the outcomes look great. 90% of people
I didn't even think of
are
that.
staying sober because those are the people that responded.
Right, because we're happy to talk about it.
Exactly.
I didn't even think about that. That's interesting.
And I think that facilities are really trying to do the best that they can. And I think that they should be more transparent, like you said, explaining 98% success rate, which means, 6 months post-discharge, this is what we found.
Right.
Because
and
families
how many
look for
participants are they, like, how many people are they surveying, so to speak? Like, I want to know that. Like, it's easy to say we have a 98% rate if I talk to 10 people that left 2 weeks ago.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I want to know those numbers. I want to know what that looks like.
Yeah. And that's, one thing when families are looking for treatment or, individuals are looking for treatment, that number is very appealing. And so what we find is a lot of facilities will use these buzzwords like success rates, like co-occurring, like individualized care, even Google searches. They know the words that people are searching and what they're looking for. I always say that another good way to test out a facility, if you're not working with someone like a treatment placement specialist or an interventionist, is actually calling their admissions. That's like the heartbeat of their program. And I came from admissions, so I feel like if you can build a connection with someone on the front end, that's a pretty good sign that the facility mimics their style and is going to be as welcoming.
Right. And you know what? That's a really good point too. And I have a list of questions like that I give families for intervention because, in an intervention, I typically will recommend 3 places that I think would be a good fit. And from there, it's on the family. They do their due diligence, look at the website, and I give them this list of questions. These are the things to ask for. And a lot of it is really simple stuff that they just wouldn't think of on their own. A lot of it is about what is the blackout period where they don't have access to their cell phone, or do they have access to internet, or are they allowed to smoke? It's simple things like that. And then there are some more serious things, questions about accreditation and things like that. In fact, if you guys want a copy of that questionnaire or list of questions, you can go to our website, Addiction Unlimited, and I will have that question under Jessica's episode in the show notes. I'll put that list of questions so you guys can check it out if you're looking for a treatment center. And obviously all of her contact information will be on there too.
And I'm glad you brought up that point of giving family options, because I never want to say this is my recommendation, because it is their decision. And it's a really big decision to make.
It's a huge decision. Yeah.
So I do a similar thing. I will send them 2, 3, 4 options. And what I'll do is say, here's the cost and here are the pros and cons based on our conversation, based on your needs. So this one's going to be a smaller milieu, or this one's going to have a better family structure, so based on their needs, I will give them several options and then say, here's kind of the strengths and weaknesses that I see, so that they can really hold all of these in the same place and see them side by side.
And you have to explore that conversation more with families too, because I'll say on each place that I will give them to explore, I'll tell them why I thought it was a good fit, just based on, like you said, it's based on the conversations that we've had about the addicted person. But I don't know that person, so I don't know them inside and out like their family does. So I'll say, well, I picked this one and I thought it would be a good fit because it has this and this and this. And that gives them a chance to go, well, when I said he likes this, I meant he likes this thing, but not this thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Then let's take that one off the table. But you have to explore those conversations and try to really find the best fit for somebody.
Absolutely. And, we talk a lot in my role about building a profile and looking at the individual, not only the addiction patterns and the substance that they're using and their recovery history, but also, like we mentioned earlier, some of the simpler things like, are they more extroverted or introverted? If they're more introverted, 120 beds is really going to be intimidating. A large campus feel, will make them want to leave against medical advice very quickly. Mm-hmm. So something more intimate where you get to know people a little bit better, that's going to make more sense. A woman with significant trauma, a female-only facility will mean the world to her in recovery.
That's so important. And I feel like people don't understand how many options there are. It runs the gamut. There are so many different options in treatment and there are something like 14,000 treatment centers in the United States, so we can find you something.
Right. And, even things like religious preference, or, if you have a support animal, if you have specific needs, that's why it's really helpful to work with someone who knows the treatment setting and the treatment facilities to help navigate that search.
The thing that I have gotten asked the most that I couldn't accommodate is couples treatment. And I haven't gotten one of those calls probably in a couple of years, really, but that was always like the one thing that I couldn't accommodate. Before that, it was pets, but now there are a lot of places, not a ton, but there's a lot of places that will take pets now because some of us are so attached to our pets. Some of us, right. But there's a huge healing piece in that too. And people, those of us that have trauma, animals are very healing, and that's a very important relationship. And I try to be mindful of that again in intervention because I understand that bond with my dog. I wouldn't want to leave my dog either. So if that's really a deal breaker, like we're going to figure it out and we're going to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah. And that's why a lot of these facilities use equine therapy is,
Yes.
I've heard someone say that a horse is just like a huge nervous system. And so our nervous system's peeing off each other. And if I'm anxious, this really warm, calm, animal is going to chill me out. And the same with dogs and cats. They have that same effect on people. Going back to the couples piece, I think for a long time it was kind of a no-no.
Sure.
A lot of facilities were saying this isn't going to work. This isn't a good idea. But you're right. More and more I have heard a handful of places that are willing to do it. I haven't run across it myself, but I think now there are some programs that are willing to do the work. The other thing I see a lot of is a lot of programs are beefing up their family work, their family week, family weekend, because what we're finding is we send our loved one, our family member off to treatment. They come home. We expect everything to be fine or normal. And the whole family system is out of whack. We've really got to work with everyone in the family system, get everyone on the same page, work through some of the stuff that happened and be able to recover as a family, as opposed to the identified patient.
It doesn't do any good to send your person away to get a bunch of help to just come back to the same broken system, right? Like everybody really needs help. And that's why too, I work with families after an intervention. Like once the person goes to treatment, I still work with the family for forever, really, but certainly while their person is in treatment, because the family has to learn a new way to communicate and process their feelings and set boundaries and understand when they're being manipulated. And it's a whole thing that has to take place. But again, it doesn't do any good to send your person away to come back to the same broken system. You're going to fall right back into those old patterns. Everybody has to get help.
And I think that's such a good mind shift of, if we're sending, our family member off to treatment, we should also be engaged in Al-Anon or seeing a therapist ourselves, or, at least doing research and reading to say, look, we're all in this together. This isn't about you're the problem. You need help. This is, hey, we have something going on that we all need to look at and address and do what we can and pitch in.
Yeah, it's a team. It really is a team. Everybody's got to participate. Thank you so much for doing this with me. It's so good to spend this time with you. And I think you really have given so much phenomenal information for people. This treatment thing has been, obviously for those of us in the industry, it's such a regular topic that I know I'm in a lot. And hopefully we've given families some good information and things to think about as well.
Well, thank you for having me. And I really enjoy being able to have a conversation around the need for individualized care and recommendations and how everyone is different and each situation is different, and to be able to come at it from that perspective and to have someone else in the community that's really addressing it in that way is huge.
Yeah. And you guys can find all of Jessica's information in show notes at addictionunlimited.com/Jessica will be her page, and we'll have everything up there. And again, I will put that list of questions for treatment centers for those of you that want to take a look at that too. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
You've reached the end of another great episode of the Addiction Unlimited podcast. Candid and honest conversation about addiction and recovery. Be sure to visit us at addictionunlimited.com to join the conversation and access show notes and links to everything we talked about. Love this episode? Please take 30 seconds to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes to help us improve and give you the information you want. Thanks for listening. See you next week.